Hello my friends, if you're new here, this is Red Spirit Mask, and on this channel we like to talk about cultural and artistic facts about Africa, and occasionally we delve into other cultures as well. Anyway, today we are showcasing what some anthropologists and archaeologists see as connections between Egypt with the rest of Africa. So if you'd like to know where the gods of Egypt originated, then stay tuned. So basically I'm going to tell you some of the things I remember having read about these connections over the years, and I emphasize the word remember because the human mind can only remember so many things. Also, I'm going to be intentionally skipping some bits of information I could give you because, for example, I'm well aware that some of my viewers enjoy watching other African history themed YouTube channels such as Home Team History, Afric Network, and From Nothing. And if you haven't heard of them before, feel free to check out their channels. But the point I'm getting at here is Home Team History recently did a video talking about Egypt's connections with the rest of Africa, and one of the main things he talked about was the land of Punt. So, for any of my viewers who've already seen his video, I don't want my viewers to feel like they're just hearing repetitive information. So if you want to learn about the land of Punt, check out Home Team History's video, and if you want an even more in-depth video, check out Afric Network's video, because he also talked about the land of Punt a long time ago. Alright, let's get this conversation started with some basics. So, the Kingdom of Kush is a kingdom that was south of Egypt in what is now modern-day Sudan. And not only do they have some very clear connections art-wise, such as the pyramids, the sphinxes, and more, but also they literally had control of Egypt at one point of history. So it's not hard to see the connections between these two civilizations. Next up we have Ethiopia. In ancient times it was known as the Kingdom of Aksum, and it had a robust trading network with not only Egypt, but also Rome, Arabia, and India. As for the Ethiopian obelisks I have on screen, it appears that there's a debate as to whether or not these obelisks are in fact inspired by Egypt, or if they are entirely an Ethiopian creation. Either way, we know the two cultures met each other. So that's the basics. The countries that are next to Egypt, of course, have some kind of connection with Egypt. Now, since I'm an artist, I want to briefly talk to you about the art of headrests. On screen now is the headrest of King Tut. But it's important to note that this furniture design can be found all throughout Africa, north, east, west, central, south. As for how important these connections are, well, that is hard to determine. Recently I found out that outside of Africa there are some people that also create headrests. Specifically, I'll show you an example from Oceania. So it's entirely possible that certain cultures created these headrest designs independently. Having said all that, if these African headrests are indeed connected, I do want to emphasize that I'm not necessarily suggesting that that furniture design came from Egypt to the rest of Africa. How about this for thought? What if it came from the rest of Africa to Egypt? Why does everyone always assume that Egypt's the one delivering all the culture? What if the rest of Africa gave some to Egypt, huh? How about that? Put that in your smoke and pipe it. I mean, you know what the I mean. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Alright, now we're going to talk about the book I have called Myth, Ritual, and Kingship in Buganda. And specifically, we will be referencing the chapter called Buganda and Ancient Egypt, Speculation and Evidence. And if you don't know, Buganda is a kingdom of Uganda, which the country of Uganda got its name from that kingdom. So the most memorable part of this chapter for me was when they compared the Ugandan king's final installation ceremony, called the Kula, with the Egyptian royal Sed festival. So for the Bugandan Kula, the Kabaka, which is their word for king, is handed a bow, and with this bow he shoots 4 arrows in each direction of the earth, saying Endasari Amahanga Kugasinga. Frankly, I probably mispronounced those words, but anyway, that means I shoot the nations to overcome them. So not only was this a way of showing dominance over the land, but it was literally meant to say that if any prince in the surrounding area tries to rebel, they will be shot to death with an arrow. Moving on to the Egyptian Sed. The Sed is a royal festival of renewal. At one point during the ceremony, the king crosses a field in 4 directions, following the points of the compass, and shoots arrows in each of the 4 directions, and then the king was enthroned 4 times, each time facing one of the 4 directions. One interpretation of this ceremony assumes that this is the king's way of asserting dominance over the land, though there is no direct indication that this ceremony was explicitly meant to ward off rebellion, like the one in Uganda. So, obviously there are some differences, but there are certainly some notable similarities here. Now, I'm not going to be pointing out every single little detail that is compared in this chapter, but I will end off with a direct quote from near the end of the chapter that I think is worth hearing. Both kingdoms created myths about a hero king who founded the kingship, died, and lived on in spiritual form. Both regarded the institution of kingship as a religio-political system that embraced the living as well as the dead rulers. Both required the new king to bury his predecessor and install his spirit in a shrine or tomb so that it could live on in the realm of the dead. Both assumed that the spiritual aspect of the dead king could survive only in relation to the king's corpse or some important part of it. Both constructed shrines that served as palaces of the royal spirits where offerings could be made. Both made use of a symbolic doorway or opening within the shrine as a device for communicating with the royal spirit. But this set of ideas is not uniquely African, and parallels to it can be found in royal myth and ritual around the world. Also worth noting is that at some part of the book, the author explains that the Egyptian kingdom ended in the BC era, whereas the earliest we can date these Ugandan kingdoms to is the 14th century AD. That leaves many centuries left unaccounted for in terms of cultural connections. Having said all that, the author does end the chapter saying that these attempts at connecting Egypt with the rest of Africa is worthwhile, since at the end of the day, Egypt is an African kingdom, and therefore we may be able to eventually find some very interesting facts about Egypt and Africa through making these connections. So yeah, the chapter ends kinda inconclusively, but that's sort of the nature of this sort of speculation, and it's also part of the reason why I don't tend to focus much of my study on these connections to Egypt, because most of the time they do end very inconclusively. But they can be interesting, and now we're going to talk about what I think is the most interesting part of today's video. We're going to look at my favorite book, or at least one of my favorite books, A History of Art in Africa. Look at these old-ass rock paintings. These things predate any Egyptian dynasty, and you know what? I want you to look real close at those figures right there. Yes, they're carrying a rhino across the desert, but that's not what's important. Their faces is what's important. They got Anubis heads. And this other painting is a painting of motherfucking Hathor. 2 Egyptian gods, way before any Egyptian dynasty, and these paintings are not found in Egypt. Anubis, the jackal-headed god. His true name is Impu, meaning royal child. He is the god of the dead and god of embalming. Hathor, the cattle-horned goddess. Hathor is the mother of all deities in Egypt. Her name means the house above. She is the goddess of the sky, women, fertility, and love. The two Anubis-looking guys, which were painted sometime after 8000 BC, were found in Libya. And you might be wondering, why the fuck is there a rhino in that painting that belongs in the Sahara? Because the Sahara wasn't a fucking desert. That's how fucking old this shit is. As for the painting with the goddess Hathor, that's from 6000 BC, and it's even further west in Algeria. Now I know some people are going to say that, hey, maybe they just drew similar looking deities, and because of the nature of how old all this it is, at the end of the day everything's kind of speculative. But let me read this quote from the book. By the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, the Egyptians worshipped a cattle-headed goddess named Hathor, whom they called the Mistress of the Western Desert. This painting may honor a horned deity of the Central Sahara, possibly one of Hathor's predecessors. So yes, I do believe that the gods of Egypt, at least some of them, originated outside of Egypt, further into Africa. There's one more rock painting I want to show you. Look at this. That is a masquerader, an ancient as masquerader, one of the earliest known depictions of a mask. And the mask, as you may know, is one of the most important aspects of sub-Saharan African religions. And this painting is found in the same exact area as that Hathor painting, the Tassili and Adjir region. And this too is dated to the same time period. So, what can we conclude from these rock images? Well, we may conclude that the religions of the north and the west of Africa were both essentially prototyped in the same region in the same motherfucking time period. Back when the Sahara was still green, and when the Sahara began to become a desert, these two cultures, these two religions, they separated, one to the Nile Valley and one to the Western Forest. But having said that, were they in fact two cultures, two neighboring cultures, or maybe they were the exact same people? Who knows? Nobody fucking knows, but it's fun to think about. But again, this is all speculative shit, and if you come to my videos often, you'll know that I don't usually do speculation. I usually give you the cold hard facts about Africa, and if that sounds interesting, please click that motherfucking subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and I hope you had fun enjoying this fascinating look at the connections between Egypt and the rest of Africa.